The morning Helen Walker walked into the Calhoun County Land Office with mud on her boots and fire in her eyes. She had exactly 14 minutes before the First Territorial Bank of Dusk Creek would beat her to it. She had known since the night before, when she had overheard two men talking in low voices outside the general store, their words carried on the dry October wind of 1882. She had pressed herself flat against the rough-hewn boards of the mercantile wall, heart-hammering, and listened as they laid out the plan plain as a butcher's cut. Cornelius Hatch, president of First Territorial Bank, intended to file a deed of seizure against the Walker homestead first thing Tuesday morning. Her homestead, the land her father had broken his back on for 11 years before fever took him in the spring. The land where her mother had planted a kitchen garden and hung laundry on a line strung between two cottonwood trees until the consumption came and took her 3 winters past. The land that was, in every way that mattered to Helen Walker, the marrow of her bones and the blood of her history. She had not slept. She had lit a single tallow candle and gone through every paper her father had ever kept, every folded document tucked in the tin box beneath the floorboard where he hid his modest savings. And she had found it, the original survey plat from 1871. The signed letter from the Territorial Land Office acknowledging the original homestead claim under the Homestead Act of 1862, and a payment receipt, faded but legible, for the first of the 5-year improvement terms. What she did not have, what had been somehow lost or never properly processed, was the final deed of title. That was what Hatch intended to exploit. He would claim the land was unproven, the title defective, the loan her father had taken against the property years ago, therefore outstanding and legally his to collect against the property itself. Helen had stood in the pre-dawn darkness of that small farmhouse kitchen, her candle nearly guttered, and made a decision with the same quiet certainty her mother had always told her she carried in her jaw. She would file a deed claim in the morning before Hatch ever set foot on the courthouse steps. She would assert her right under the Homestead Act, under her father's original filing, and she would do it herself because there was no one else left to do it. The only problem was that a deed claim filed by a woman in 1882 in the territory of New Mexico required a witness signature. The law was clear on that. A woman acting without a male guardian or husband needed a corroborating adult male witness to validate the filing. It was an injustice so ordinary in that era that most women simply accepted it the way they accepted bad harvests and hard winters, as a fact of life rather than a wrong to be righted. Helen accepted nothing, but she also was not stupid about the world she lived in. She needed a witness, and she needed one before the sun climbed another inch above the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. She had ridden hard into Dusk Creek in the dark, her horse Molasses blowing steam in the cold morning air, and she had knocked on 3 doors. The first man, old Silas Prout, owed Hatch money and turned her away before she finished her first sentence. The second, a cattle hand named Deckard who boarded above the feed store, was polite but pale, telling her he could not afford to cross the bank. The third door she knocked on belonged to a man she barely knew. Warren Atkins had arrived in Dusk Creek only 6 weeks prior. He was 31 years old, lean and brown from years under the open sky, with calloused hands that told a story of honest labor and a quiet manner that some men mistook for indifference. He had come down from Colorado after 2 years working a cattle drive along the Goodnight-loving trail, and he had stopped in Dusk Creek because his horse had thrown a shoe and the blacksmith had been closed. He had stayed because the land around the valley reminded him of something he could not quite name, some feeling of belonging he had been chasing his whole adult life without fully understanding what he was chasing. He rented a room above the Dusk Creek Hotel, a respectable establishment run by a widow named Mrs. Calloway, and he had been taking his time deciding what came next. He had enough money saved from the cattle work to buy a modest plot if he found the right one. He had been looking. He had been thinking. He had not been sleeping particularly well, which was why the knock at his door at 5:30 in the morning found him already dressed, sitting by his window watching the black sky turn the deep blue of approaching dawn. He opened the door and found a woman standing in the dim corridor with dark circles under her eyes, mud on her coat, and a tin box clutched under one arm like it contained the crown jewels. She was perhaps 28, he thought, with dark hair pinned severely back and brown eyes that were doing the work of keeping herself composed under what was obviously enormous strain. She was, despite everything about the moment, the most striking person he had encountered in 6 weeks in this town, or possibly much longer. "My name is Helen Walker," she said, without preamble, without apology for the hour. "I own the Walker homestead, 4 miles east on the Pecos Road. The First Territorial Bank is going to try to file a deed of seizure against my property this morning when the land office opens. I need a witness to sign my deed claim. I have been told by 2 men already that they will not help me. I am asking you because you are the only other person in this town I have not yet asked, and I am running out of time." Warren Atkins looked at her for 3 full seconds. Then he reached back into his room, took his hat from the hook by the door, and said, "Give me 2 minutes to get my boots." She had not expected that. She had steeled herself for another polite refusal, another pair of eyes sliding away from hers. She stood in the corridor blinking for a moment before she gathered herself back together. "Thank you," she said, and meant it more than 2 words had ever carried before in her life. They walked quickly through the streets of Dusk Creek, which were just beginning to show the first signs of life. A baker was lighting his ovens. A stray dog lifted its head to watch them pass. Helen explained everything as they walked, her voice low and precise, laying out the situation the way a general lays out a battlefield for a new officer. She showed him the documents from the tin box. He read them by the light of a street lamp, holding each one carefully, asking 2 or 3 short, intelligent questions that told her he understood the law of the land better than most cowboys she had known. "Your father's original filing is solid," he said, handing the survey plat back to her. "The homestead claim is legitimate under the Act. The bank is going to argue the defective title, but if you file the deed claim first and get it stamped and witnessed before they file the seizure, you establish priority. Their action becomes secondary." "That is exactly right," Helen said, and looked at him with something that was not quite surprise but was adjacent to it. "How do you know land law?" "I spent a winter in Denver with a lawyer friend," Warren said. "He liked to talk. I liked to listen." They reached the land office at 3 minutes past 6. The clerk, a nervous young man named Tobias Fenn who had been harassed by both sides of Dusk Creek's various disputes more times than he cared to count, looked up from his desk with the expression of a man who already knew his morning was about to become difficult. "Miss Walker," he said carefully. "Tobias," Helen said, placing the tin box on his counter. "I am here to file a deed claim on the Walker homestead, Lot 14 of the 1871 Pecos Valley survey, under the original homestead filing of James Elias Walker, deceased, with myself as heir and continuing claimant. I have my documents and I have my witness." Tobias looked at Warren. Warren met his gaze steadily. "I need the filing form," Helen continued, "and I need it stamped and signed before 7 o'clock. Tobias swallowed. "Miss Walker, I want you to understand that the bank has made certain representations to this office about the Walker property, and Mr. Hatch has indicated he would be filing. Is there a law that says I cannot file first?" Helen asked. Tobias hesitated. "No, ma'am." "Then I suggest you get me the form." He got her the form. Helen filled it out with a hand that was absolutely steady, which Warren noticed and quietly admired. She wrote in a clear, firm script, each letter precise, each entry accurate and complete. She cited the original homestead filing, the survey plat, the improvement documentation, her father's death record which she had also thought to bring, and her own identity as sole surviving heir. She cited the Homestead Act of 1862, the territorial regulations of New Mexico, and the standard provision for heir continuation of claim. When she finished, she slid the form across to Warren. He read it. He looked at her. She looked back at him with those steady brown eyes, and there was a whole conversation in that look that neither of them was ready to speak aloud yet. He picked up the pen, and in the space labeled witness, he wrote his name in full. Warren James Atkins. Dust Creek, New Mexico Territory, October 3, 1882. Tobias stamped it at 6:47 in the morning. Cornelius Hatch arrived at 7:15, red-faced and accompanied by a lawyer from Santa Fe named Dobbins, and found the deed claim already filed, already stamped, already entered into the record. He stood at Tobias Fenn's counter and read the filing 3 times. His face went through several colors. Dobbins leaned over his shoulder and read it as well, then spoke quietly in Hatch's ear. Hatch's jaw worked in silence for a long moment. Helen Walker stood against the far wall of the land office with her tin box under her arm and watched him. "This woman has no proper guardian," Hatch finally said, his voice thick with controlled fury. "The filing is irregular." "The filing has a witness," Tobias said, with more spine than he usually managed to locate before 9 in the morning. "A legally qualified adult male witness, as required by territorial code. Mr. Atkins signed." Hatch looked at Warren Atkins for the first time. He was the kind of man who categorized people instantly and permanently, and he categorized Warren as an outsider, an unknown quantity, a problem. "Who are you?" he demanded. "Warren Atkins," Warren said pleasantly. "I'm the witness who signed." There was nothing Hatch could do. Dobbins knew it. They left without filing anything. The deed claim stood. Outside on the boardwalk in the thin gold light of the early morning, Helen Walker finally let out the breath she had been holding since some time the previous evening. It came out of her in a long, shaking exhale, and she pressed the tin box against her chest and closed her eyes for just a moment. "It held," she said quietly. "It held," Warren confirmed. He was leaning against the post of the land office porch, watching her with an expression he was keeping carefully neutral. He was not entirely succeeding. She opened her eyes and looked at him directly, the way she did everything without flinching. "I owe you a considerable debt, Mr. Atkins." "You don't owe me anything," he said. "You had the documents, you had the law, all I did was hold a pen." "You held more than a pen," she said. "You held your ground when 2 men before you wouldn't. Don't diminish it." He considered this. He was not a man who accepted compliments easily, not because of false modesty, but because he genuinely measured things carefully before he agreed with them. "All right," he said finally. "Then I'm glad I was there to hold it." They stood on the boardwalk for a moment that stretched pleasantly, neither of them quite ready to end the conversation and go their separate ways. The town was waking up fully now, horses and wagons beginning to move, the smell of wood smoke and frying bacon drifting from the hotel kitchen down the street. "Have you eaten?" Warren asked. Helen thought about it and realized she had not since the previous afternoon. Her stomach chose that moment to provide confirmation. She pressed her lips together against a smile. "I have not." "Mrs. Calloway does a good breakfast at the hotel," he said. "Not as a debt. Just as 2 people who have been awake since before dawn and could use some eggs." She looked at him a moment longer. Then she said, "All right, just as 2 people who could use some eggs." They walked to the hotel together, and it was the beginning of everything. Over breakfast that morning, while the rest of Dust Creek went about its business, and Cornelius Hatch sat in his bank office presumably plotting his next move, Helen Walker and Warren Atkins talked for 2 hours. They talked the way people do when they recognize, without quite articulating it, that they are in the presence of someone rare, someone whose mind works in a way that makes conversation feel less like the exchange of information, and more like the construction of something new between 2 people. She told him about her father, James Walker, who had come to New Mexico Territory from Kentucky in 1870, with $40 and a stubborn conviction that the land along the Pecos Valley was as good as anything he had left behind. He had filed his homestead claim, built the house with his own hands, planted fields and tended cattle and fought drought and dust storms, and the occasional dispute with neighboring ranchers over water rights. He had been, by every measure, a man who earned what he had. Helen had grown up working beside him, learning the land the way other girls learned needlework, because her father believed that a person's worth was in what they could do, regardless of whether they wore a dress or trousers. She did not say any of this with self-pity. She said it with a matter-of-fact directness that Warren found bracing and honest, like stepping outside on a cold, clear day. He told her about Colorado, about the cattle drives, about 2 years of sky and distance and work that satisfied the body while leaving the mind somewhat underfed. He told her about his family in Missouri, a father who had farmed and a mother who had taught school in the township, and about his own restlessness that had started at 17 and had never quite resolved itself into a single direction. "What are you looking for?" Helen asked. It was a direct question, the kind most people avoided. She asked it with genuine curiosity, not challenge. He thought about it honestly. "Something that feels like it matters," he said. "Work that's mine, land that's mine. Maybe something more than that, but I haven't entirely worked out the shape of it yet." She nodded slowly, as if she understood exactly what he meant and was not going to make him feel strange about saying it. They parted on the hotel steps when the clock above the general store showed 8:30. She had to get back to the homestead, she said. There was work to do and livestock that had been fed late and would be expressing their opinions about it. He said he understood. She extended her hand and he shook it, and neither of them held on a moment longer than was proper, but both of them were aware of the warmth of it. "Thank you again, Mr. Atkins," she said. "Warren," he said, "please." A small smile crossed her face. It transformed her entirely. Not that she had been unhappy before, but the smile revealed something warm and open underneath the capable composure, something that made him want very badly to see it again. "Thank you, Warren." "Helen," he said, and the way he said it was quiet and careful, like he was placing something valuable down gently. She heard it. She turned and walked toward where she had hitched Molasses, and he watched her go. And he stood on the hotel steps for a moment after she had ridden out of sight, not entirely certain what had just happened to him, but with a strong suspicion that it was significant. Cornelius Hatch was not a man who accepted defeat. He had built First Territorial Bank from a 2-room shack operation in 1874 into the most powerful financial institution in Calhoun County through a combination of genuine business acumen and a ruthless understanding of leverage. When he wanted something, he found multiple paths to it. The Walker homestead was something he wanted badly. The land sat at the junction of 2 creek tributaries that fed the eastern valley, and whoever owned that water access effectively controlled irrigation for several hundred acres of surrounding range. Hatch had buyers lined up. He had plans drawn. Helen Walker and her tin box of papers were an inconvenience, not an end. Within 3 days of the failed seizure filing, 2 things happened that told Helen the fight was not over. First, her east fence line was cut, and 20 head of cattle wandered onto neighboring Beaumont land. She spent a full day collecting them, riding hard in cold autumn rain, and came home exhausted and furious. Second, a letter arrived from a lawyer in Santa Fe, not Dobbins but a different one, informing her that the bank was contesting the deed claim on the grounds that the original homestead improvement records were incomplete, and that therefore the 5-year proof of improvement required under the Homestead Act had never been legally certified. She sat at her kitchen table with the letter and read it twice. Then she put it face down on the table and thought about everything her father had ever told her about not letting men with money make you feel smaller than you were. She thought about Warren Atkins, which surprised her. She had been thinking about him with a frequency that she found both inconvenient and honest. She thought about the way he had read her documents under the street lamp with genuine attention, and the way he had answered her question at breakfast without deflecting, and the way he had said her name at the end. She had spoken to him for perhaps 3 hours in total. It seemed disproportionate, how much space he had taken up in her thinking. She folded the letter and put it in the tin box. Then she put on her coat and rode to Dusk Creek. She told herself it was because she needed information, because Warren had legal knowledge that could help her respond to the bank's new claim. Both of these things were true. They were also not the complete truth, and she was honest enough with herself to know it. She found him at the blacksmith shop, as it happened, watching a bay horse get shod. He was leaning on the fence rail in that easy way he had, hat tipped back slightly, one boot hooked on the lower rail. He turned when he heard her ride up, and something in his face shifted, a small, unguarded brightening that he didn't quite have time to school away before she saw it. "Helen," he said, straightening up. "Warren," she said, "I have a new problem." She showed him the letter there by the blacksmith shop in the smell of hot iron and horses. He read it carefully, asked her 2 questions about her father's documentation, and then said, "They're going after the improvement certification. It's a technical argument, but it's not without some basis. Do you have the annual improvement reports your father would have submitted to the territorial office?" "I have some of them," she said. "Not all. Some years there was no formal submission, just the work done and witnessed by neighbors." "Then we need the neighbors who witnessed," Warren said. "Written statements signed and dated attesting to the improvements made. Do you know who was around during those years?" "Elsa and Carl Newman," Helen said. "German family, been here since 1873. Carl has a good memory and he respected my father. And the Corrigan brothers, they rode fence line with my father every spring for 6 years running." "That's enough," Warren said. "If we can get signed affidavits from those witnesses and file them as supporting documentation with the deed claim, it significantly weakens the bank's contestation." She was looking at him in a way that made him slightly warm under the collar. "You are very useful, Warren Atkins," she said. "I'm trying to be," he said, and the simplicity of it made her smile, and there it was again, that smile, and he had the same reaction to it that he'd had 3 days ago. He offered to ride out with her to the Newman farm, which was 2 miles northeast. She accepted. They rode side by side on the autumn road, the cottonwood trees along the creek line burning gold and amber in the afternoon light, the Sangre de Cristo Mountains standing blue and enormous to the east. He had not seen country this beautiful in years, he said. She said she had never seen anywhere that compared to it, though she had not traveled far. He asked her if she wanted to. She thought about it and said that she didn't think so, that she loved this valley with a completeness that didn't leave much room for wanting somewhere else. "What about a life?" he asked. "Besides the land?" It was a question that walked right up to the edge of something personal, and they both knew it. He had asked it carefully, with enough openness that she could take it any direction she chose. "I have thought about it," she said, which was more candid than she usually allowed herself to be. "My father always said the right person would show up at the right time, and in the meantime there was work to do." "Your father sounds like he was a wise man," Warren said. "He was," Helen said quietly. "I miss him every day." Carl Newman was a big, red-faced man with white whiskers and small, sharp eyes that had watched a lot of the world and decided on the evidence that most people were worth helping. He remembered James Walker clearly, remembered the fence work and the well digging and the field clearing, and he was happy to put it in writing. His wife Elsa brought out coffee and black bread, and they sat at the Newmans' kitchen table while Carl dictated and Warren wrote it out in a clean, precise hand that the older man watched with approval. "You write good," Carl said. "You a lawyer?" "No," Warren said. "He might as well be," Helen said, and smiled across the table at him. And Carl Newman noticed and exchanged a look with his wife that communicated a great deal in the silent language of people who have been married for many years. They rode to the Corrigan brothers' place afterward. The brothers, Daniel and Frank, were in their 40s, weathered and taciturn in the way of men who spent most of their time outdoors. They remembered James Walker, and they disliked Cornelius Hatch, which made them cooperative. Frank Corrigan signed his affidavit with a flourish that suggested he was pleased to have a legal occasion to record his opinion of the bank. By the time Helen and Warren rode back toward Dust Creek with 4 signed affidavits in the tin box, the sun was tilting west and painting the mountains pink and gold. They slowed naturally on the road, both of them finding reasons to extend the ride a little. "I'll bring these to Tobias in the morning," Helen said, "as supplemental filing. I can ride out and bring them myself if you'd rather not make the trip again tomorrow," Warren offered. "Your signature on a cover statement would be enough and I could deliver it." She looked at him. "Why would you do that?" He held her gaze. "Because I'd like to help you." The simplicity of it again. No performance, no angling. She found it almost disarming. "Warren," she said carefully, "I don't want you to feel obligated because of the witness signing. That was a generous thing you did, and I don't expect it's not obligation," he said. "I was honest with you at breakfast. I'm looking for something that feels like it matters. This matters." He paused. "You matter if I'm being fully honest, and I'd rather be honest than strategic about it." The road was quiet around them. A meadowlark called somewhere in the dry grass. Helen Walker sat her horse and looked at this man she had known for 4 days, this man who had walked out his hotel door in the early morning with his hat in his hand, and she felt something open carefully in her chest, like a door that had been shut and latched for a long time slowly giving way. "You're very direct," she said. "So are you," he said. She looked away, toward the mountains, and she was quiet for a long moment, and he let her be quiet because he sensed that was what she needed, and because he was the kind of man who understood that patience was not the same as passivity. "I think I would like to have dinner tomorrow evening," she said. "If you are available, not as a debt, not as a business meeting, as something else." "I'm available," he said, without hesitation. She nodded, as if confirming something to herself. Then she put her heels to molasses and rode toward the homestead, and Warren sat his horse and watched her go and thought that he had stopped wandering, and that it had happened without him even noticing the moment it occurred. Dinner the next evening was at the hotel's dining room, which Mrs. Calloway ran with starched tablecloths and real silverware, and a pride in her kitchen that she made clear to anyone who ordered carelessly. Warren had put on a clean shirt and his good jacket, the dark one, and Helen had come in wearing a dress he had not seen before, a deep brown that set off the warm tone of her skin and the darkness of her eyes, her hair down from its severe pins and arranged more softly around her face. She looked, he thought, like someone who had allowed herself a different version of herself for the evening, and the allowing of it made her even more beautiful. She noticed how he looked at her, which she was not entirely accustomed to. Men in Dust Creek had generally regarded Helen Walker as capable, admirable, and unapproachable, the latter quality somewhat of her own construction. Warren was looking at her with a warmth that was respectful and transparent, making no pretense of not finding her beautiful, and she found that she did not want to deflect it. They talked through the meal about things that had nothing to do with deed claims or bank lawyers, about books they had read and places they had been, and ideas they had formed about the world in the way that people do when they are young enough to still find the world interesting and old enough to have developed opinions about it. He had read more than she expected, borrowing from libraries in Denver and Santa Fe, and carrying a battered copy of Emerson in his saddlebag, which he mentioned somewhat sheepishly. She told him she had Dickens and Bronte and a Spanish grammar book, because a third of the people in the valley spoke Spanish and she thought it rude not to be able to communicate. "Can you," he asked, "speak Spanish?" "Enough," she said. "I know when someone is insulting me and I know how to insult them back, which covers the necessary range." He laughed, a real one, surprised out of him, and she heard how good it sounded. After dinner they walked, because neither of them was ready to end the evening. The night was cold and clear, the stars enormous over the high desert, and they walked down the main street of Dust Creek and then out past the edge of town where the road opened up, and the darkness was complete except for starlight. He told her then about Missouri, about his father's illness 2 years back, and how he had not made it home in time, and how that guilt lived in him still. She told him about sitting with her mother through the consumption, the long, careful nights, and the helplessness of watching someone you love diminish, and the way grief did not get smaller with time but that you got larger around it, learned to carry it differently. That's the most accurate description of it I've ever heard, he said quietly. She was looking up at the stars. He was looking at her. He was close enough that he could see her breath in the cold air, small pale clouds dissolving into darkness. Helen, he said. She turned her face toward him. I know it hasn't been long, he said. I know you have every reason to be cautious, but I would like very much to keep showing up if you'll let me. Keep showing up, she said, as if testing the words. To help, he said, with the bank situation, with whatever else needs doing, and to see you, primarily to see you. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I have been telling myself that I find you useful, Warren, that the reason I keep thinking about you is the legal knowledge and the practical help. Is it? He asked. No, she said, and for the first time in the conversation she sounded almost uncertain, which was perhaps more honest than anything else she could have given him. No, it isn't. He reached out and took her hand in the dark. She let him. Her fingers were cold and she laced them through his, and they stood there under the New Mexico stars while the wind moved through the dry grass and the mountains stood patient and ancient in the darkness. All right, she said finally. Keep showing up. The legal fight with Hatch took 2 more weeks, during which time Warren Atkins was at the Walker homestead nearly every day. Not always for legal reasons. He fixed the east fence line that had been cut. He helped bring in the last of the fall feed corn, working alongside Helen in the dry autumn air, learning the rhythms of the farm and finding that they suited him more than he had expected anything to suit him. In the evenings he stayed for supper and they sat by the fire in the parlor, and sometimes they talked and sometimes they were simply quiet together, which he found more intimate than most conversations he had ever had. She was not an easy woman in the sense of being biddable or deferential. She had opinions and stated them. She had preferences and kept them. She could be stubborn in the way of people who have learned to rely entirely on themselves, and he recognized it because he had something of the same quality in himself. When they disagreed, which happened, it was the honest kind of disagreement between 2 people who respect each other enough to be direct, and it ended the way honest disagreements between people who care for each other should end, in compromise or in one or the other genuinely changing their mind. He noticed that she worked too hard and did not ask for help easily. He noticed that she almost never mentioned being tired or uncomfortable. He noticed that she had built a small, self-sufficient life that was admirable and somewhat lonely, and that she had done it so competently that she had convinced herself she preferred it that way. He was not certain she was wrong, but he was certain there was room for more. She noticed that he was steadier than he appeared, that the wandering quality she had initially attributed to him was less about restlessness and more about the particular kind of searching that happens when a person knows clearly what they value but hasn't yet found a place to put those values down. She noticed that he made himself genuinely useful without making it a performance of usefulness. She noticed that he listened more than he spoke, and that when he spoke it was worth hearing. The morning the supplemental affidavits were filed, Tobias Fenn received them, read them carefully, and said, Miss Walker, I believe this is sufficient to answer the bank's contestation. The improvements are documented. The witnesses are credible. The original claim stands. He said it with a kind of relieved satisfaction, as if he had been wanting to say it for some time. Cornelius Hatch received formal notification 2 days later that his contestation had been rejected and the deed claim confirmed. He appeared in the land office one more time with Dobbins at his side and reviewed the documentation at length. He was a man who knew when a position was lost, even if he hated to admit it. He left without filing anything further. That evening, Helen was in the barn when she heard Warren's horse on the road. She had been expecting him. She came out wiping her hands on a cloth and saw him dismounting with a paper in his hand, and before she could ask he said, It's over. The deed is confirmed. Hatch has withdrawn. She stood in the barn doorway and heard those words, and something that had been held very tight in her chest for weeks, for months really, since her father had died and left her alone with the responsibility and the fear of losing it all. Something in her chest finally released its hold. Her eyes filled, which surprised her. She was not, as a rule, a woman who cried easily. Warren came to her immediately, without hesitation, and she let him, which also surprised her. He put his arms around her, and she turned her face into his shoulder and breathed through the brief, quiet storm of it, the tears that came and then passed, and the relief that was larger than the fear had been. He held her as long as she needed and said nothing, which was exactly right. When she lifted her face, she was composed again, though her eyes were still bright. He was looking at her with an expression she had never seen directed at her before, one that was so utterly uncomplicated in its feeling, so simply and entirely warm that she had to look at it for a moment without moving. "I'm keeping the farm," she said. "You're keeping the farm," he confirmed. She put her hand against his chest for a moment. Then she stepped back, and the practical Helen Walker, who knew what needed doing, returned to her posture, except that she was smiling. "I have a pot of soup on. Come inside." He came inside. He stayed for supper, and then he stayed by the fire, and then the moon came up high over the valley, and he realized it was late and said he should ride back to town. She walked him out to where his horse was tied, and in the moonlight on the porch of her father's house, on her land, on the land that was now unambiguously hers, she reached up and kissed him. It was not an impulsive thing. She had been thinking about it for at least a week. It was deliberate and complete, and he kissed her back with his hands on her face. And it was not the tentative, questioning kiss of strangers, but the certain kiss of two people who already know the answer and are simply finally saying it. When it ended, she looked at him in the moonlight, and he was looking at her with that expression again, the warm, uncomplicated one, except now it was also something else, something deeper and more specific. "I'm not leaving Dusk Creek," he said. It was not a question. It was a statement of intention presented for her response. "Good," she said, and meant it with her whole heart. In the weeks that followed, Warren Atkins made good on his stated intention, with a thoroughness that made it plain this was not passing sentiment. He had been looking at land, and the 40 acres adjacent to the Walker homestead, the Bauer plot that old Heinrich Bauer had sold in September before moving to live with his daughter in Albuquerque, was still available through the Territorial Land Office. It was good land, south-facing, with access to the same creek tributary that made the Walker land valuable. He filed on it on a Thursday in early November in his own name, and Tobias Fenn processed the filing with considerably less drama than Helen's had involved, though the young clerk did look at Warren with a new and particular interest that suggested he had been following the situation with attention. That evening Warren rode out to tell Helen. She was in the kitchen garden, which she tended through the fall with an optimism that he found very characteristic of her, pulling dead summer plants and turning the soil for winter. She looked up when he rode in, shielding her eyes from the low afternoon sun. "I filed on the Bauer land today," he said. She straightened up slowly. She had dirt on her hands, and her cheeks were cold-reddened from the autumn air, and she looked at him with an expression that was carefully checking something. "The 40 acres south of here," she said. "That's the one," he said. "That land shares my Eastern Creek access," she said. "I know," he said. "I thought we might work it cooperatively, if that suited you." She looked at him for a long moment. The responsible, practical part of her mind was running through the implications of shared water rights and cooperative farming, and what a man 40 acres to the south would mean in practical terms for her daily life. The rest of her mind was considerably ahead of those calculations. "Cooperatively," she said. "It's a start," he said. She went back to pulling dead plants, but she was smiling, and he could see it even from the saddle. He moved into the Bauer place in the third week of November, which required significant work to make habitable before winter settled in. The house was structurally sound, but had been empty since September and wanted fresh chinking in the walls, new glass in 2 broken windows, and a general cleaning that he applied himself to with the same methodical energy he brought to everything. Helen came over twice to help, bringing food and company, and they worked together in the small house, and it was easy between them in the way that domestic partnership between well-matched people can be easy, each anticipating what the other needed and filling it without ceremony. On the second of those evenings, when the house was clean and warm and he had a fire going and she had made coffee on his new stove, he sat across from her at his kitchen table and said, "I want to ask you something and I want you to answer honestly without considering what you think I want to hear." She put down her coffee. "All right. Is this moving too fast for you?" he asked. "The land being here, what's between us? I can take my time. I have nothing but time." She considered it genuinely, not dismissively. "No," she said. "It's moving at exactly the rate that makes sense. Things in the West don't have the luxury of moving slowly. The land, the weather, the seasons, none of it waits. People who wait too long out here lose things." She met his eyes. "I don't want to lose this." "Neither do I," he said. "Then we understand each other," she said, and picked up her coffee. December came with force, as it did in that high desert country, blowing cold off the mountains and filling the valley with wind that cut through coat and hat and good intentions alike. Helen's cattle were in their winter pasture and she was cutting feed daily, and Warren was doing the same on his land. They fell into a pattern without ever formally agreeing to it, working their own places through the mornings and coming together in the afternoons, sometimes on her land and sometimes on his, sharing the kind of labor that is easier with two people, and finding that the two of them together constituted something more than the sum of individual effort. Mrs. Calloway, who had retained a fondness for Warren from his hotel days, told him over a supply run to town that Dust Creek was talking. "In a favorable way," she added quickly, seeing his expression. "People have a lot of respect for Helen Walker. Her father was well liked. People are glad to see her have some support." She paused. "And some company." He asked Helen about it that evening. They were on her porch, bundled in coats, watching the stars over the valley. She looked sideways at him. "People have been wondering when I was going to stop pretending to be self-sufficient," she said. "You are self-sufficient," he said. "I know," she said. "That's what I've been trying to tell them." He laughed. She leaned against him, which she had been doing for about 3 weeks now in the easy, habitual way of people who have stopped negotiating about proximity and simply arrived at it naturally. He put his arm around her and pulled her closer against the cold. "I was thinking," he said, "about the spring." "What about it?" "The Bower land and your south field share that whole creek length. If we ran a proper irrigation channel from the main tributary, we could open up another 60 acres for grazing between the two of us." She thought about the engineering of it. "It would take a lot of digging," she said. "I know," he said. "But with a good strong spring and two people who aren't afraid of digging, we could do it," she said. "We could do a lot of things," he said, and there was something different in his voice, a gravity underneath the practical suggestion. She tilted her face up to look at him. He was looking down at her. "Helen," he said, "I've been thinking about this carefully, not impulsively. I want you to know that." She was very still. "I would like to ask you to marry me," he said. "Not because of the land or the water rights or the cooperative farming. Because of you. Because I have not been still in years, and since I met you in that land office I have not wanted to be anywhere else. Because you are the most honest person I have ever met and the most capable and the most worth knowing, and because I am entirely certain that I love you, which I did not expect to be certain of quite this quickly, but here we are." The stars were brilliant over the valley. The wind had eased and the night was almost breathlessly quiet. Helen Walker had been alone, genuinely alone, for 3 years. She had carried her grief and her responsibility and her fear with a competence and a self-sufficiency that had kept her upright and forward-moving through all of it. She had built a life that was real and good and entirely hers. She had not known, quite, what she had been building it for, and then one October morning she had knocked on a stranger's door in the dark, and the answer had been standing there with his boots in his hand. "Yes," she said. "I would like that very much." He kissed her, there on the porch in the cold December night, with the mountains dark against the stars and the valley spread out below them. And it was the kind of moment that a person carries inside them for their whole life. A moment so complete and so exactly right that it fills a space you had not quite known was empty. They were married in March of 1883, on the first genuinely warm day of the year when the sun came out with some real meaning behind it, and the cottonwoods were just beginning to show their first tender leaves. The ceremony was held outdoors on Helen's land, in front of the farmhouse her father had built, with the mountains standing witness in the east. Mrs. Calloway cried, which no one who knew her would have predicted, but she did. The Newmans were there, Carl beaming, and Elsa having pressed her best dress for the occasion. Daniel and Frank Corrigan came in clean shirts with their hats in their hands. Tobias Fenn attended and seemed very pleased with himself in a modest way, as if he felt some personal credit for how things had turned out. The minister was a man named Reverend Clay, from the small Methodist church in Dusk Creek, who performed the ceremony with a warmth and a brevity that suited both of them. Warren stood in his good jacket with his hair combed, and his expression one of such undisguised happiness that Daniel Corrigan later told his brother he had never seen a bridegroom look quite so thoroughly sure of himself, and not in an arrogant way, but in the way of a man who has found his destination after a long journey and recognizes it clearly. Helen wore a cream-colored dress that had been her mother's, altered to fit her, and she carried a small bunch of early spring wildflowers that Warren had ridden out into the valley to find at dawn. He had presented them to her before the guests arrived, awkwardly, as if not sure how they would be received, and she had taken them and pressed them briefly against her chest, and looked at him with so much in her eyes that he had been briefly overwhelmed by it. The vows they spoke were the traditional ones, but they meant them with the particular weight of two people who have already been tested by something real and have already proven themselves to each other in concrete ways. When they were pronounced husband and wife, and he kissed her in front of everyone, there was a round of genuine cheering from the assembled group, and Carl Newman's voice was the loudest. They had a dinner on long tables set up in the yard, and there was food enough that Mrs. Calloway kept commenting approvingly on it, and there was music from a fiddle that Frank Corrigan produced unexpectedly from his saddlebag and played with considerable skill. Helen danced with Warren in the spring afternoon, and then with Carl Newman, who was a surprisingly light dancer for a man of his size, and then again with Warren, and she was laughing, really laughing, the way she had not laughed freely in a long time, and Warren watched her from where he stood talking with the Corrigan brothers, and felt a love for her so specific and so large that it was almost like a physical thing in his chest. The integration of the two properties began in earnest that spring, as planned. The irrigation channel took 6 weeks of hard work, with Warren doing most of the primary digging and Helen handling the engineering of the water diversion with a precision that impressed him thoroughly. 3 neighboring families contributed a few days of labor each in the mutual aid tradition of the frontier, and by early May the channel was running, and the combined 60 acres of new grazing land was available. Helen made it clear from the beginning of their marriage that the homestead remained hers, that her name was on the deed and would stay on the deed, and that the Atkins land to the south was his. Warren agreed with this entirely, seeing it as both just and practical. They operated the combined property as a unit but maintained the separate legal identities, which proved to be not only right in principle but wise in practice, as it gave Helen an independence of title that no future circumstance could easily challenge. Cornelius Hatch tried one more time that summer. Not through the courts this time, but through a private offer, a cash purchase offer delivered by letter, for both the Walker homestead and the Atkins land combined. The offer was, Helen noted to Warren, significantly higher than market value, which confirmed that Hatch's interest in the water access was as strong as she had always suspected. Warren read the letter, then looked at Helen. "What do you want to do, "Decline," she said, firmly. He wrote the response himself, a polite but completely unambiguous refusal, citing the Walker family's historical connection to the land and making clear that the property was not for sale at any price. He signed it Warren and Helen Atkins, which was the first time their names had appeared together on a formal document, and Helen looked at it and felt a satisfaction that was partly victory and partly something much quieter and more personal. Hatch made no further attempts. He was a practical man in the end, and his attention eventually moved to other acquisitions. By the end of that first year of their marriage, the farm was producing well. The cattle herd had grown by 12 head from a purchase Warren made in August from a drover passing through. The south field that had been marginal under the old irrigation situation was producing good grass. The kitchen garden was the best it had been since Helen's mother had tended it, because now there were 2 people to work it in the evenings, and the time could be properly spent. They had settled into a life that was full without being frenetic, shaped around the natural rhythms of the land and the animals and the seasons. They were up at first light, worked through the day in the satisfying way of people whose work has consequence, and in the evenings they were together, reading or talking or simply sitting, and the quiet between them was as comfortable and warm as any conversation. There were hard days. The frontier was not sentimental about hardship. A drought in July made the grazing difficult and required hard decisions about the cattle. A late frost killed Helen's early garden plantings, and she spent 2 cold mornings replanting with the controlled fury of someone determined not to let nature have the last word. A dispute with a neighbor named Grady over a property marker required 3 weeks of careful negotiation before it was resolved. Warren's horse threw a shoe on a rocky stretch in September and came up lame, requiring several weeks of careful management before he was sound again. They navigated these things the way they had first come together, directly and practically, and with an underlying confidence in each other that made even difficult things manageable. When Helen was frustrated, she said so. When Warren was worried, he said so. They had established this kind of honesty early, and it held through everything. In the winter of 1883, Helen told him she thought she was expecting. She said it in the kitchen one morning before dawn, while the coffee was heating, with a directness that was entirely hers and a slight tremor in her voice that was the only tell. He looked at her for 3 seconds, and then he crossed the kitchen and held her, and she laughed against his shoulder, a surprised, happy sound. A son was born the following August, a solid, furious boy who arrived on a Saturday evening and announced himself to the Sangre de Cristo Mountains in a voice that suggested he intended to be heard. They named him James, for Helen's father, which Warren had suggested without prompting, and the naming made Helen cry in a way she had not cried since the deed-claim morning, the kind of crying that was not sadness but was its close neighbor, gratitude and grief and love all occupying the same moment. James Walker Atkins was a robust child who took after both of them in different features and all of them in the category of stubbornness. He had Warren's gray eyes and Helen's jaw in her father's hands, and he was the kind of baby who reached for everything within arm's length, with an enthusiasm that suggested he was already planning the work he intended to do. The birth brought Elsa Newman over frequently that first month, along with Mrs. Calloway, who had an unexpected gift with infants that she deployed with great satisfaction. Warren, who had no experience whatsoever with babies, learned quickly, and with a willingness to be taught that Helen found deeply endearing. He was a natural with the boy, possessing the patience and steadiness that an infant requires, and she would sometimes watch him in the evenings with James on his knee and feel the particular quiet joy of a person who has built exactly the right life. The spring of 1884 was the best season the combined property had ever seen, a wet winter having filled the creek and the spring coming early and mild. The new grazing acres were in full use, the cattle were fat and healthy, and the kitchen garden was larger than it had ever been in the homestead's history. Warren spent 2 weeks that April building an addition to the farmhouse, 2 more rooms that the growing family would need, working in the evenings with the sound of James playing in the yard, and Helen calling from the kitchen with the particular tone that meant supper was nearly ready. The addition was solid work. Warren had learned timber framing from a man in Colorado who had been a carpenter before he became a cowboy, and the skills had not left him. Helen inspected every joint with a critical eye and found nothing to fault, which was her version of high praise, and he knew it. That summer, Warren rode to Santa Fe on a matter of registering the combined water rights, a legal step that would secure their irrigation access in perpetuity regardless of what future claims anyone might make on the surrounding land. It was a 4-day round trip, the first time they had been apart since the wedding, and Helen found the house notably emptier without him, which she acknowledged to herself with the honesty she applied to everything. He came back with the registration papers and a small package wrapped in brown paper. She unwrapped it and found a book, a Spanish-English dictionary, good quality, which made her laugh because she had mentioned months ago that her old one was falling apart. He had remembered. He had gone to Santa Fe on land business and remembered a comment she had made about a dictionary and brought one back, and she looked at him across the kitchen holding this book and felt so specifically loved, not in an abstract or general sense, but in the particular, attentive, daily way that real love expressed itself, that it was almost difficult to contain. "You remembered," she said. "I remember most things you say," he said, which was true. She went to him and kissed him firmly and then handed him James, who had been tugging at his boot since he walked through the door and was now expressing his opinion of being ignored. The second child came in the winter of 1885, a girl this time, who arrived in a January snowstorm with far less drama than her brother had managed, as if she had assessed the situation and decided there was no point in making a fuss about it. They named her Clara, which had been Helen's mother's name, and Warren held the tiny dark-haired girl with the same carefully controlled emotion he had held James with, this specific, private tenderness that he only ever fully showed in moments like this. James, at 16 months, was not entirely sure about Clara, but came around within a week when she demonstrated the ability to watch him with apparent fascination, which he found satisfying. The winter that Clara was born was also the winter that Cornelius Hatch's bank finally overextended itself in a series of bad cattle loans that left him significantly less powerful than he had been in 1882. First Territorial Bank did not fail entirely, but it contracted sharply, and Hatch himself spent the following years in a much reduced circumstance. Helen heard about this through the general store network of information that functioned as Dust Creek's newspaper, and she felt no particular satisfaction and no particular regret, simply the quiet recognition that what is taken without right tends to have a way of not holding. Tobias Fenn had been promoted to Deputy Land Registrar by 1885, a promotion he had earned through 3 years of doing his job correctly even when it was complicated, and Helen felt a genuine pleasure at this when she heard it. She told Warren, who said that Tobias was a good man who had shown spine when spine was needed, which was the highest compliment he gave to people. By the spring of 1886, the Walker Atkins property, as the surrounding community had taken to calling it, was one of the most prosperous small operations in the Pecos Valley. Not the largest, not the wealthiest, but solid and well-managed and possessed of a reputation for honest dealing that meant other ranchers sought their cooperation on joint ventures. They were involved in a shared cattle drive that spring with 3 neighboring families, working a combined herd down to Las Vegas, New Mexico, where the market was good. Warren led the drive, and Helen managed both properties during his 10-day absence with a competence that surprised no one who knew her. He came back from the drive with money in his pocket and mud on his boots, and a look in his eyes that she recognized, the look of a man who has done good work at a distance and is very glad to be home. She was on the porch when he rode in, and she came down the steps without waiting, which she did not always do, and the fact of her coming to him, rather than waiting for him to come to her, told him everything about how she had felt about the 10 days. "The children missed you," she said, taking his horse's reins. "Only the children?" he asked. She looked at him directly with those eyes that never flinched. "No," she said. He stepped down from the saddle and pulled her close, still dusty and trail-worn, and she let him, pressing her face briefly against his neck in a gesture that was simple and complete. James burst through the screen door at that moment and launched himself down the steps with the full commitment physicality of a nearly 3-year-old. And Warren caught him and swung him up, and the boy laughed in the way that was the best sound in the world. And Clara appeared at the door, being held by Elsa Newman, who had been helping while Warren was away. And the evening was full and warm, and the mountains stood in the east as they always had, patient and permanent. That fall they expanded the cattle operation, purchasing 12 more head from a drive that came through in September, bringing their combined herd to 63 animals. Warren had identified a young man named Diego Ruiz, 20 years old, son of a Mexican family who had farmed in the valley for 2 generations, as a reliable hand who could help manage the expanding workload. Diego had grown up with cattle and horses, and had his father's quiet competence and a good humor that made him easy to work with. Helen had hired him after a 10-minute conversation in Spanish that had impressed them both, and left Diego with a clear understanding that this was a household where work was taken seriously and treated honestly. Diego had a girl in Dust Creek, a lively young woman named Rosa Esperanza, who worked in the hotel kitchen, and the courtship had the quality of 2 people who were clearly meant for each other, but were doing all the proper circling before getting to the obvious conclusion. Helen watched this with a private sympathy that Warren noticed. "Reminds you of anyone?" he asked one evening, watching her watch the 2 young people talking by the fence after the day's work. "No one in particular," she said, perfectly straight-faced. He laughed and put his arm around her, and she leaned into him in the easy, habitual way she had, his wife of 3 years, the mother of his children, the owner of this land, the most capable and clear-eyed and difficult and wonderful person he had ever known. The winter of 1886 was hard, as some winters were in that country, cold coming early and staying late. But the house was solid, the food stores were full, and the family came through it with the warmth of people who have built something real together. Warren developed a persistent cough in January that frightened Helen more than she showed, but it resolved by February with rest and the honey and whiskey treatment that Elsa Newman swore by, and she allowed herself the relief she had been holding carefully in reserve. He recovered fully and was irritated by the period of enforced rest, and she was merciless about making him keep it until Elsa pronounced him sound. And he bore this with a good grace that told Helen more about how he had changed than almost anything else, that the man who had been perpetually moving had learned not only to stop, but to let himself be cared for. In the spring of 1887, 5 years after the morning everything had started, Helen stood in the kitchen of the farmhouse her father had built, which had 2 new rooms now and fresh whitewash on the walls and curtains she had sewn herself, and made coffee in the early morning before anyone else was awake. James would be up soon, noisy and purposeful in the way he always was. Clara would sleep another hour, her dark hair spread on the pillow, her father's gray eyes shut in dreams. Warren was still in the bed they shared, warm and slow-breathing, and he had the quality and sleep of a man who had no outstanding worries, which was the most reliable indicator of a life well-built that she knew. She stood with her coffee and looked out the east window at the mountains, which were turning gold in the first light. The land ran south and east from the house in the flat particular beauty of the Pecos Valley, the creek line marked by cottonwoods that were barely beginning to leaf, the fields emerging from winter brown into the first pale green of spring grass. The Bower land, Warren's land, stretched away to the south, and the irrigation channel they had built together crossed both properties in a line that was one of her proudest physical accomplishments, a practical thing that was also a kind of monument to what they had made. She heard him in the bedroom, the sound of him waking. Footsteps quiet to avoid waking Clara. The door. He appeared in the kitchen doorway in his shirt and trousers, his hair uncombed, and she looked at him across the kitchen in the early morning light with 5 years of marriage in her eyes and everything that came with it, the hard days and the good ones, the grief they had held for each other and the laughter that was specifically theirs, the children who were both of them in different ways, the land they had kept and built again. "Coffee," he said. "There," she said, nodding at the pot. He poured a cup and came to stand beside her at the window. They looked out at the morning together. "Spring's early this year," he said. "Good," she said. "The South Field needs it." He glanced at her sideways. She was looking at the mountains with the expression she had when she was thinking about more than one thing simultaneously, which was most of the time. "What?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. "I was thinking about that morning," she said. "October, 1882. 14 minutes," he said. She turned to look at him. "You remember?" "I remember most things you say," he said, and his voice had the same warmth it had always had, the same specific quality that was entirely his and entirely for her. She put her hand on his arm. "I knocked on 2 doors before yours," she said. "2 men who wouldn't help." "I know," he said. "I'm glad they didn't." "So am I," she said quietly. "So am I." James appeared in the doorway then, in the full deployment of an almost 4-year-old who has decided morning has officially begun, and the kitchen filled immediately with his voice and his questions, and his absolute certainty that breakfast should happen immediately. And the quiet moment dissolved into the warm, ordinary chaos of the day beginning. And Helen made breakfast and Warren fed the horses and Clara woke up and was brought to the table by her father. And the morning became the rest of the day, which became the rest of the season, which became the rest of a life that was built on something real. In the summer of that year, Diego Ruiz married Rosa Esperanza in the Dust Creek Church, and the whole community turned out, and Helen stood at the back of the church and watched the young couple at the altar with Warren's hand in hers. And when they turned to leave after the ceremony, she caught Warren looking at her with the smile that was specifically his, private and warm, and she squeezed his hand. "Happy?" he asked, low enough that only she could hear. "Entirely," she said, and meant it without reservation. The deed that Tobias Fenn had stamped on that October morning 5 years ago hung framed above the fireplace in the Walker Atkins homestead, because Helen had put it there and Warren had never suggested otherwise, because they both understood what it represented. Not just the land, not just the victory over Hatch and his lawyers, but the morning itself, the decision made before dawn, the tin box carried through the dark streets, the door that opened at the right moment. The frame was simple wood, unadorned. The document inside was yellowed at the edges, the stamp slightly blurred, the ink of 2 signatures side by side. Helen Walker filed claim. Warren James Atkins witness. People who visited and noticed it sometimes asked about it. Warren would tell the story plainly and without embellishment, ending it where it ended, with the stamp at 6:47 in the morning and the bank president's face as he read the filing, and the part where they went to breakfast. That was where Helen always joined the telling, and people who heard them tell it together, finishing each other's sentences in the comfortable way of people who have told a story many times because it is their favorite one. Those people left the homestead with the particular feeling of having been shown something true about how things could go when they went right. By 1889, James was big enough to help with real work on the farm, which he did with a seriousness that made Warren quietly proud and Helen outwardly laugh, because he was so much his father's son in this earnest investment in getting a task done correctly. Clara was 4 and had her grandmother's name and her grandmother's garden instincts, heading immediately for any patch of earth that could be made to grow something. They were good children, which was not luck, but was partly the consequence of being raised by 2 people who were themselves good, consistently and practically good, who treated each other with respect and everyone around them the same way. There was a third child on the way by the end of 1889. Helen told Warren on the porch one evening in September, the same porch where he had asked her to marry him, the mountains dark against the stars. He received the news the same way he had received it the first 2 times, with a stillness that was not shock but was its positive opposite, the stillness of a person absorbing something wonderful. "A third," he said. "A third," she confirmed. He looked at the mountains. "Your father would be glad," he said. She nodded, her throat briefly tight. "He would have loved all of it," she said. "The farm as it is now, the children, you," she paused. "Especially you, I think. He would have liked you very much." Warren looked at her with everything he was in his face, no reserve, no careful neutral expression, just the full weight of what he felt for her and this land and this life. "I wish I could have known him," he said. "He's here," she said simply, and touched the porch post of the house he had built. In all of this, the third child, a boy again, came in April of 1890, the most beautiful spring the valley had seen in years, which Helen declared was entirely appropriate. They named him Robert, for Warren's father, which made Warren go quiet in the careful way he did when something moved him deeply. Robert Atkins came into the world healthy and loud, and with a look of general curiosity about his surroundings that suggested he intended to investigate everything in reach as soon as possible. The homestead that spring was full in every direction, full of children and animals and work, and the particular noise of a house where things were growing. Helen tended the garden and managed the books and road fence line when she could, and was still, in all of it herself, the same Helen who had walked into the land office with her tin box and her 14 minutes. Warren worked the land and managed the herd and watched his wife and his children and his valley with a gratitude that was so consistent and so specific that it had become part of his character, the particular quality of a man who knows exactly what he has and does not take it lightly. They were not wealthy people. They were not famous. The frontier in 1890 was beginning its slow transition toward something that was less wild and more settled, the railroad coming closer each year, the territory edging toward statehood, the wide open quality of the landscape being gently, incrementally hemmed in by fences and roads, and the machinery of a civilization that was arriving whether the land invited it or not. But on the Walker Atkins homestead on the Pecos Road, 4 miles east of Dust Creek, New Mexico territory, there was a life that was full and honest and built on a foundation that could not be seized by banks or contested by lawyers or worn down by seasons. There was a deed hanging above the fireplace. There was a channel running clear with spring water through land that had been kept by the people who loved it. There was a woman who had stood her ground in the dark with a tin box and enough courage for the whole county, and a man who had walked out his door with his boots in his hand and never really walked back. James Walker would have been proud. Clara Walker, who had planted her kitchen garden with her own hands and raised her daughter to know her own worth, would have been proud. The mountains in the east, which had watched all of it, the building and the breaking and the building again, stood patient and permanent as ever, unchanged by any of the human matters at their feet, though if mountains could be said to approve of anything, they approved of this. Helen stood on her porch on a May morning in 1890 with her coffee and her third child on her hip, and her husband coming up from the barn with hay on his jacket and her 2 older children running ahead of him, and she looked at this picture with the full attention it deserved. She did not take it quickly, did not move past it to the next thing. She stood with it, the way her father had always told her to stand with good things, to hold them clearly and completely, because the world moves fast and the good things deserve your full attention while they are here. Warren came up to the porch and took Robert from her arms without asking, the easy transfer of a child between 2 people who have done it many times, and he looked at her with the same eyes that had looked at her across the counter of a hotel breakfast room 8 years ago, except now they were the eyes of a man who had stopped searching because he had found everything, and he knew it. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. She took his hand and they stood on the porch of her father's house, on her land, their land, in the morning that belonged to all of it. And the mountains were gold and the cottonwoods were green and the creek ran clear in its channel. And everything that had been fought for was still there, and everything that had been built was still standing. The deed was safe on the wall. The witness had stayed. And the woman who had filed it was exactly where she intended to be, which was here, which was home, which was the life she had refused to let anyone take from her, and had found, in the taking of it back, was larger and fuller and more complete than she had ever dared to plan for. Outside, somewhere in the direction of the south field, James Atkins was attempting to explain to his younger sister why the frogs that lived in the irrigation channel were not appropriate subjects for indoor study, and she was disagreeing with him with the calm authority of a child who has learned her negotiating style from her mother. Robert, on Warren's hip, watched the mountains with his father's gray eyes. The October wind that came in the afternoons still moved the cottonwoods in the way it always had. The mountains did not move at all. The valley held the light in the late afternoon the way it had always held it, golden and long and complete. And the woman who had walked through the dark with her tin box, and the man who had signed his name on a winter morning without knowing what he was signing toward, had built a life together that neither drought nor bank nor distance nor time would take from them. And that was the whole story, and it was enough, and it was everything.